Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. A pretty tumultuous day in Canberra. PM under pressure about foreign criminals released into the Australian community as he got on his plane yet again, headed off to San Francisco this afternoon. Here's what's coming up tonight on the show. Another day and yet another blatant display of prejudice against the Australian Jewish community. A Western Sydney company refusing to rent a jumping castle to school children. Now, they said they're not anti-Jewish, they're just anti-Israel. Why punish school kids here in Australia? We're being told our energy system can handle the hot summer ahead, but at the same time, the market operator says we can't afford unexpected outages or supply shocks. Now, that doesn't stack up. And it comes to the same day as investment experts are saying the government's renewable energy policy is in trouble. Plus, the PM, as I said, off to APEC in San Francisco to meet with Presidents Biden and Xi, but he's only just met with them in the US and China a couple of weeks ago. Even Labor backbenchers are saying his constant travel overseas is hurting them with voters. And Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil confusing and frankly out of her depth today, at odds with the Deputy Prime Minister over plans now for Labor to legislate to fix the problem of 83 foreign criminals out in the Australian community. She's lost her Secretary of the Department. He stood down today too, her head of cyber security. This is fast becoming a crisis.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
In terms of looking at legislative options going forward, we are examining all of that in the face of this decision.
But first, at one level, a business refusing to supply a jumping castle to a Jewish school is just showy, low-rent, lefty virtue signalling. But at another level, it's a sign of the rampant anti-Semitism that the Gaza war has triggered and of the double standards and the one-sidedness of our vast anti-racism bureaucracy. Just think of the reaction should a pub refuse service to Aboriginal people, or a venue refuse to host a same-sex wedding reception. Now, so far, there's not been a peep from the Human Rights Commission or any of the other many bodies that are set up to ensure that people aren't discriminated against on the basis of race or religion. Just as none of these entities have been vocal in their denunciation of the race hate so evident in the Gas the Jews rally in support of Hamas out the front of the Opera House, or the numerous anti-Israel marches that have so disfigured our big cities these past 4 weeks. Here's the Human Rights Commission website where it clearly states, and I quote, "It's against the law for a provider of goods and services to discriminate against a person by refusing to provide goods and services or facilities because of his or her race." But that's exactly what a Western Sydney business has done, posting on its Instagram page a response to the Jewish school's request for a quote. "There's no way," says the business operator, "I'm taking a Zionist booking." Adding on social media, "I don't want your blood money, free Palestine." Now, good on the New South Wales Premier, Labor's Chris Minns, for calling this outrageous and for asking for it to be investigated. But somehow I doubt our politically correct thought police are going to spend much time coming down now on anti-Semitism when they haven't before. I'm dealing with this tomorrow in my column for The Australian, but there's a shocking double standard now in evidence, not just from the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protesters trying to intimidate Australian Jews near a Melbourne synagogue last week, or by gunning their motorbikes en masse through a largely Jewish part of Sydney. Not just the double standards either from Islamist hate preachers celebrating the Hamas atrocities, but denouncing Israel's measured and proportionate military response. But also the clear double standards from the government ministers who imply moral equivalence by calling out an next to non-existent Islamophobia wherever they can't avoid calling out anti-Semitism, so obviously on display in the wake of the Hamas butchery. Opposition leader Peter Dutton was quite right to call on the Prime Minister today for an urgent National Cabinet meeting to deal with the race hate that's now teetering on the brink of civil unrest.
I've written to the Prime Minister and will release that letter shortly, which calls on the Prime Minister to convene a national cabinet to speak to the premiers and to the chief ministers about what the joined-up response should be, because I fear that there will be a significant act within our country that will cause harm.
A little later today, though, in question time, Peter Dutton gave what I regard as his best speech to date as leader when he took the Prime Minister to task over his lack of spine on anti-Semitism, as well as the left's catastrophic failure to protect Australians from the 83 convicted foreign criminals it's just released into our community.
And this Prime Minister had a solemn duty, Mr Speaker, to stand up and to make sure that his government spoke with one voice. But did they do that? No. And what the Australian public has seen and what has shocked the Jewish community in recent weeks since the 7th of October is that this government is speaking out of both sides of its mouth. Let's call it out for what it is. This Prime Minister needs to stand up and to be united with the Jewish community. Now, what compounds it, Mr Speaker, is the fact that in the last 48 hours we learned that the hapless Minister for Immigration has taken a decision to release 83 hardened criminals, rapists, pedophiles, murderers, the rest of the detail he won't disclose, release those 83 people to live at large in the community. Did the Prime Minister pull him into line? Not a chance, Mr Speaker. Not a chance, because this Prime Minister is as weak as water and the Australian public are working out what a fake and a fraud he and his government have turned out to be.
If the Australian Human Rights Commission can come down hard on journalists, even cartoonists, who they say offend Aboriginal people, why not on a business that refuses to serve Jews? And why not on everyone who's currently promoting a new Holocaust by demanding the destruction of Israel? If state police can disperse anti-lockdown marches with tear gas and rubber bullets, as we saw in Victoria, why do they do nothing to disperse the anti-Jewish marches happening now weekend after weekend? Unfortunately, there's really only one explanation, and that is that Labor has been taken over by the radical Green left, that it's no longer the party of principled leaders like Bob Hawke. How else can you explain the reluctance of Labor MPs and union supporters to see a moral and legal difference between pro-Palestinian types barracking for a terror group and all Australians, Jewish and non-Jewish Australians, who support Israel's fight for national survival? It was Hawke, let's not forget, who said, if the bell tolls for Israel, it won't just toll for Israel, it will toll for all mankind. Now, they were prescient words for sure, but also just another sign of how far modern Labor has fallen. As I said, a very busy, hectic day in Canberra today. We'll go there for the headlines now. Sky's political reporter, Joel Philp.
Good evening. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has urged the Prime Minister to abandon his overseas APEC trip and keep Parliament sitting until laws are passed to get a group of refugees who are convicted of violent crimes back into custody, after the High Court determined they could not be held in indefinite detention.
We will sit down with the government. We will sit additional hours through the night, whatever it takes, to get these people back into custody, which is where they belong.
Order. This is what he said in May in this chamber. The Parliament cannot out-legislate the Constitution. But when it's convenient, we'll just chuck it out and pretend it doesn't exist.
83 people have now been released into the Australian community, including convicted sex offenders and murderers. The government wants these people off the streets, but says it is powerless to do so.
I wish that they could be kept in detention. If it was up to me, I would keep them in detention. I can't do that. The High Court has made a call.
The government says the released detainees have been placed on the strictest visa conditions possible, as it works on legislation in response.
you kind of have to have the decision to understand what then needs to be done in terms of remedying it. We need to be making sure that in putting in place a legislative response here, it is legally robust and it survives any challenge.
At the same time, the opposition leader has urged the Prime Minister to convene a national cabinet meeting to address the rise in anti-Semitism. The offices of federal ministers have been targeted by pro-Palestine protesters. Props of fake bodies wrapped in bloodied white bags have been placed outside politicians' offices across Melbourne. Ministers including Richard Marles, Bill Shorten and Andrew Giles were some of the MPs targeted in the protests. National Cyber Security Coordinator Air Marshal Darren Goldie has been recalled to Defence and put on leave to deal with what Sky News understands is a HR matter relating to his time in Defence.
I'm very puzzled by this, and I think the government needs to be upfront about exactly what they're alluding to in the media statement that they issued today. I mean, he was being praised by the government as early as this week.
The senior Air Force officer was brought into the pivotal role in July, and the announcement of his departure comes as the federal government has been preparing to release its long-awaited cyber security strategy next week.
As I said, a lot to get through. Joining me now, the national editor at the Daily Telegraph, Sky News host James Morrow, and Sky News Northern Australia correspondent, the award-winning Matt Cunningham. I'll get to your award in a moment, Matt, at the end of this little segment, but I'll start with you, James, if I can. The opposition leader said to the PM, please don't go to San Francisco. We need you here. It's APEC. You've just met President Xi in China. You've just met President Biden in Washington. You and I both know the communique that they'll release after this summit. It's already been drafted. It'll be with the PM's office right now. It clearly hasn't listened because he got on the plane about 4 o'clock this afternoon. But politically, he's really got some big issues here at home to fix, hasn't he?
He's got massive issues, Peter, and I think Peter Dutton did a very good job today really articulating two of the big ones here. Number one, of course, the rising tide of anti-Semitism, and we had in the Daily Telegraph today reported about a Jewish school that wanted to hire a jumping castle, and the company that owned the jumping castle company said they wouldn't provide it because the school had Zionist blood on their hands, or words to that effect. So people are rightly really concerned about what's happening there. And then, of course, there's also the issue of the 83 detainees who've been released, and some of these are really, really horrible criminals. I'm talking child rapists, things like that. Again, released because the High Court has said, oh, well, you can't have indefinite detention anymore. And the government, again, appears to be flat-footed on that. Now, you combine that with the economic situation and other things that are going on, people think the country is on the wrong track. And I don't have any problem, Peter, with the Prime Minister going around the world to sell Australia, do what they need to do diplomatically. But boy, he is needed here at home, not just for his party, but for the country.
Those comments today, and I played them there from the Home Affairs Minister saying she can't legislate to fix this issue of the 83 foreign criminals. And then, of course, the Deputy Prime Minister saying, well, actually, we are. We're looking at legislation. And then pressure from the Greens, and this is happening quite a lot, you know, that the left of Labor are really pushed even further to the hard left by the Greens. They went out very hard saying you can't do a deal with Peter Dutton. Have a listen.
Peter Dutton's been demonising and being cruel to refugees for decades. It would be an utter disgrace if Labor were to work with Peter Dutton to collude with him to jam it through the Parliament this week. It looks like Labor is now going to jump into bed with Peter Dutton, who's built a career on cruelty to refugees, and write legislation to continue that cruelty.
I might say many of these people are not refugees. Greens use that language all the time. Matt Cunningham, they've been looked at, assessed, they've been found not to be refugees. It's just that the countries they've come from, because they're criminals, refuse to take them back, and so we are stuck with them. But this is an issue, isn't it? It's cut right through the community at the moment, hasn't it?
Oh, it absolutely has, and Labor's been all over the shop on this today. I mean, the contrast between Claire O'Neill's comments and Richard Marles's comments, both on Breakfast TV this morning, in complete contradiction of one another. You know, you had Claire O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister, saying, you know, that we couldn't overrule the decision of the High Court, and then you had Richard Marles saying the opposite. Then you've had Penny Wong in Senate question time this afternoon saying that that the government will legislate on this issue, and that they're hoping to get the opposition's support to do it. I mean, deep down, Labor knows that on issues like this, particularly when it comes to immigration, that if they get pulled too far to the left, they're going to be in all sorts of trouble. I mean, it's cost them elections before. If you look back to 2013, when the coalition campaigned hard on Labor's performance on border protection, that was a massive issue in Labor losing government back then. I think that Labor really want to sort this one out quickly. I think the opposition leader knows that he's hitting a real sore point within Labor, and he knows that there's fractures within the Labor Party about this issue. That's what he's trying to exploit. I think that some of the wiser heads in Labor will be trying to get this sorted sooner rather than later.
I'm sorry, James, but we've just had confirmation, haven't we, in the last few hours from the United States, from intelligence operations there in Washington, to say that there is now evidence confirmation, that there is the use of hospitals in Gaza by terror organisation Hamas. This is what we've talked about, this being something that is rumoured. It's now confirmed.
Well, it's confirmed by the U.S., but, Peter, I mean, Israel has been saying this for ages, so I don't know why we need the U.S. to confirm something that Israel has already said when, of course, people seem to be willing to take the Hamas Ministry of Health, as Orwellian a name as that is, for its word. They should take Israel for its word, too. The important thing about this, too, is that in Article 19 of the Geneva Conventions, once a hospital becomes used by a militant group or a military for military offensive purposes, which is what is happening here, it loses its protected status. So this again underlines the way that Hamas so cynically uses Palestinian people, Arab people, to create this sort of situation where they get all of this sympathy for being just plain evil.
Matt, just on that issue today, it mightn't seem like a big thing to some people that a Jewish school asked for a quote for a jumping castle for an event for kids and was told they wouldn't have it because this company in Western Sydney wouldn't provide any goods and services to Jews. They then said, well, we're not against Jews, we're against Israel. Well, hang on, this is a school in Sydney, it wasn't a school in Jerusalem. But I have to say, we all remember Bill Leak. He had a cartoon calling out an uncaring Aboriginal parent. Well, he was absolutely taken to the cleaners through all of those human rights organisations that exist. How do they go after issues about a cartoon and the myriad of human rights bodies in this country, anti-racism bodies, anti-discrimination bodies, are basically silent at the moment on anti-Semitism?
Well, yeah, that was absolutely terrible what happened to Bill Leak, and his family members believe that it helped drive him to an early death. And that wasn't the only case. There was a Catholic bishop in Tasmania who was hauled through a similar process because he was distributing flyers opposed to the same-sex marriage plebiscite. Here in Darwin, I remember we had a barber who was hauled before the Anti-Discrimination Commission because she ran a men's barber shop and she refused to give a woman a haircut. These are the sort of things that, these commissions have been getting themselves tied up in knots about, and yet here we have a clear case of religious and racial discrimination, and we haven't heard boo from them at this point. I thought it was interesting in Kenny Heatley's report on this issue today. He said that under this Act, under this Anti-Discrimination Commission, that religious discrimination is not actually part of that. It's only, Jewish people only fall under that because they're considered a race for the purpose of this legislation. So I think there's a loophole there as well, because I think, to be refusing people a service of any kind, whether it's a jumping castle or whether it's a plumber or an electrician, because they are of a particular faith or a particular race, is something that has no place in this country.
And we know too, James Morrow, we've got a case in Tasmania. A councillor has been taken to official task over the fact that she referred to a trans woman as remaining a biological male. Well, that's a statement of scientific fact.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Peter, it's so funny in all these cases, in Australia, we love to say that we trust the science, we believe in science. Oh, the holy, blessed science tells us things. And yet when somebody, goes against what is now the woke ideology, which of course means that science can be bent to mean anything that they want it to mean, of course, you're in trouble. And this is just the whole problem here. If you cannot say that A is A, that a biological male is a biological male, somebody born a certain way, their chromosomes, which they cannot change, then science becomes such a captured institution of politics, and we cannot rely on it any more than we can these human rights bodies that are using science to perpetrate their own very unscientific agendas.
Just let's go to the broader issue of migration and the cost of living crisis, Matt Cunningham, and this real squeeze on housing. Bruce Chapman, he's the bloke who designed the HEX scheme all those years ago. He's an economist. He's now backing a new $1 billion a year levy that he wants to see, and others do, on international students on their fees. The group of 8 universities, they're the most prestigious in the country. They say this is basically an envy tax. I don't know, I reckon it's pretty fair, given half the PM's current migrant intake are international students. They're helping push up rents and cause us all the other issues that are fueling inflation. What do you think?
Well, I'd like to thank Bruce, first of all, for keeping me poor into my early 30s, Peter, but I think it is it is a good idea. You look at I read the story about this in The Australian, and we're talking about these universities taking in $10 billion through international students. So if you've got, a tax of 5 to 10%, you're talking about $500 million to $1 billion that can go back into the federal government's coffers at a time when that money is much needed. I think another thing that was interesting, reading the comments of Professor Chapman, was, talking about how we can get more people who come from regional areas of this country to university. I mean, one of the great things I had growing up was parents who wanted me to go to university and a system that allowed me to do that. But it's getting harder and harder for people like me who grew up in country Victoria to get a spot in one of our top universities. So, aside from all the points you make about inflation and about housing and all of these other issues, I think also we should be trying to give a fair go to people from remote and regional Australia who also want a place in our top universities.
Spot on. I'm a country kid too, and I agree with you, Matt. And I'm about to go to a break, but I want to say too, I haven't spoken to you since you got the top award at our recent News Corp awards night. A huge feather in your cap, absolutely well deserved for your reporting on the Northern Territory crisis in Alice Springs. I know you feel really deeply about the issue, and it's genuine, so well done to you. James Morrow, thank you, and I'll catch you on Sunday with Outsiders. All right, after the break, Australia's energy grid teetering on the brink as we head into summer and our power stations age, and renewable energy is failing. Plus, after the break, I'll be joined by the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, live to get his thoughts on Labor's failure to keep our streets safe, and also what needs to happen in the face of unprecedented anti-Semitism. Coming up, the not-so-good news about our energy grid going into summer, and the Melbourne school students being urged to ditch school next week and participate in a pro-Palestinian strike. But first, let's go back to Canberra, where today tensions reached boiling point in question time regarding the release of 83 criminals, it's now 83, from the immigration detention centres across the country into the community. Joining me to discuss this, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton, thank you for your time. I know it's hectic for you at the moment. You urged the Prime Minister to put emergency legislation into the Parliament to fix this issue exposed by last week's High Court decision. Has the Prime Minister or the Minister met with you to discuss this?
No is the answer, Peter. They haven't reached out. We're very keen to be a part of supporting any legislation which is going to address the issue. Just to rewind a second, the government had a decision handed down by the High Court, as you've discussed on the show, and the submission by the government's solicitor talks about 92 people. Now, interestingly, the Minister is confirming today that 83 have been released into the community and the others remain behind bars. Now, the government had a very basic question to answer today. Why does the High Court ruling compel you to release the 83 but not the balance? Now, the government can't answer that question. The Prime Minister refused to even say today that they were considering legislation. And the important point here is that the legislation should have been in draft form anticipating the High Court outcome so that these people wouldn't have been released into the community and they wouldn't pose the threat that is quite obvious now. They do pose a very significant threat.
Let's just help people at home follow that point you're making, because I think it's very important that it is understood. I mean, when you go forward and you try and defend a case like this, as the government did, it tried to defend the fact that these people should remain in detention. They would always have a contingency plan in and around the ministry that says, OK, if the judgment doesn't go our way, if we lose this case, what's our plan B? Now, the government has tried to imply this is all sprung on them, but it was eminently foreseeable, wasn't it?
Well, you're exactly right. Any good minister, bearing in mind that the Minister for Immigration is the most litigated minister in the Commonwealth, just given the number of cases that they're dealing with, the approvals, the cancellations of visas, the change in conditions, etc. A lot of that is contested in the courts. And the minister would have been briefed on the prospects in this case. And if the prospects weren't great, then the minister should have instructed his department to start drafting legislation to address the anomaly that the High Court had identified. If you don't do that, then you end up with the outcome that we've got now, and that is that people are released. These are hardened criminals. They're pedophiles, they're rapists, they're murderers. The government promised us a briefing on Monday. There's still no briefing that's been provided. Initially, the government said that there was no prospect of legislation that could address the High Court concerns. The Deputy Prime Minister was out on TV this morning saying that they were considering legislation now, so their story keeps changing. The Prime Minister made no mention of legislation today, as I said, but Penny Wong in the Senate said that the government was going to introduce legislation. And it turns out that Minister Giles has released these people to go and live in motels at taxpayers' expense, with money being given to them each day for their expenses. And as it turns out, he's released people without putting them on a visa at all, which is nothing short of negligent.
If they're going to try and fix this before Parliament rises at the end of next week, I mean, they've obviously got to talk to you. You haven't had a briefing, you haven't seen legislation, they haven't reached out to you. Do we even know where these 83 foreign criminals are living?
Well, we know where some of them are living. There was a front page story in the West Australian today about people who had been housed in hotel accommodation. They've been out partying, drinking, and taxpayers are picking up the bill for their accommodation. It is just quite unbelievable. Honestly, I was the Minister for Immigration. We dealt with some tough cases and lots of cases that went to the High Court. As Home Affairs Minister, same story. I've never seen anything like this in my 22 years in the Parliament. And Minister Giles has some sort of ideological position about not keeping these people in jail. These are non-citizens. These aren't Australian citizens. They're non-citizens who have committed crimes, heinous crimes against Australian citizens, and they will commit further crimes. And the government initially comes out with this story, oh, well, you can't pass legislation. Now it turns out you can pass legislation. Well, it should have been passed as soon as the decision was handed down by the High Court, so that these people could have been kept in custody, because they are going to offend against other Australians.
Well, let's just talk honestly. I mean, you've been in that portfolio for some time in the former government. I mean, you've got a minister who's just lost her cyber security expert. They had an update coming out next week. Who knows what will happen there? She's got the former, or current, he's actually just being stood down, Secretary of the Department on protracted leave, under an investigation because of text messages. We know that Giles, the Immigration Minister, who reports through to the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill too, was caught out doing a whole lot of fundraisers for ethnic communities in the recent Labor state election here in Victoria. I mean, you've got to wonder that this is not a department that's in turmoil, is it?
Well, the Home Affairs Department was once, under the coalition government, as you well know, a department that kept our borders secure. Now, it turns out that the government's got people arriving on boats that they haven't spoken about publicly. They've got women and children on Nauru at the moment, but the public hasn't been given the detail. And the fact is that the people smugglers see Claire O'Neill as a complete joke, as many people in her department do. She carries on like she's still playing student politics at university. And what happens when you get distracted by all of that nonsense is you take your eye off the ball and you allow criminals to be released into the community. And that's exactly what's happened here. The Department of Home Affairs has some amazing people in it, but at the moment, I think they're completely bewildered with the direction of the Albanese government, and there are decisions that the government's making which make it harder for those criminals to lose their visas in other cases. And we know that they've already watered down the laws which prevent people being sent back to New Zealand, for example, even if they've committed very serious crimes in our country.
You and I know, though, the fish rots from the head. I mean, you've got a Prime Minister who's barely in the country. He's gone to APEC. He's meeting with the Chinese President and the US President. We only met with them 2 weeks ago. He could have sent the Deputy Prime Minister. You have said he needed to stay in Australia, have a national cabinet. That doesn't get you a seat at the table. You're asking for a national cabinet because you want all the state premiers around the table to deal with, I guess, growing concern about anti-Semitism and I think a real risk of civil unrest. Why do you want to see a national cabinet, and what do you think about Labor's, I guess, really mixed messages on the question of anti-Semitism?
Well, Peter, there's no doubt the Prime Minister has a role to play internationally, and we accept that. However, the situation is that the Prime Minister has to act in the best interests of Australians first. And the Australian public, the ones who voted for him, believing, frankly, that he was someone different than he's turned out to be, they voted for him knowing that or believing that the Prime Minister would have them as his priority. And we said today the Prime Minister shouldn't travel overseas again until he fixes this problem. He needs to fix the problem with legislation in the Parliament this week to make sure that those people go back into immigration detention and that they don't pose a threat to the broader community. Secondly, and the very significant issue that the Prime Minister needs to deal with at the moment is the very significant rise of anti-Semitism. There is a very strong concern bordering on fear within the Jewish community at the moment. We're seeing all sorts of reported cases about anti-Semitic behaviour. The school activity that we've seen where kids just want to go and play, they're being violated against because of their religion, and the grotesque acts that we've seen from some protesters going into Jewish communities trying to goad people into confrontation. That's completely unacceptable, and the Prime Minister has the responsibility to deal with it. The best way that he can deal with it is to convene a national cabinet, which hasn't been convened on this issue. That brings all the premiers and chief ministers together. It gets an understanding from the state and territory police commissioners on what is happening, what they're seeing, and there is overall leadership provided by the Prime Minister at that meeting so that the premiers can go away knowing what it is that is expected of them by the Prime Minister. Chris Minns at the moment seems to be playing a very strong role. Victoria's Premier is a disgrace. In Queensland, Premier Palaszczuk's essentially checked out, and you're having a situation where there's not a consistency of approach, and the Prime Minister should be stepping up and demonstrating a leadership based in strength, not weakness. And I think Australians at the moment are saying, well, hang on, you've got domestic issues to deal with. Before you go on yet another overseas trip, please stay, prioritise us and deal with these issues. And he's not doing that.
You're not wrong, Peter Dutton. Thank you for your time. I want to just add too, I mean, I remember many situations, and I was there personally doing briefings with other expert staff from the Prime Minister's office, and Bill Shorten will back me up here. When he was opposition leader, we briefed him many times on terror-related issues, on important legislation where we thought there might be bipartisanship, on issues like Islamic State, on the siege, the Martin Place siege, I remember that well, in Sydney, and a whole lot more. The fact that Peter Dutton has not even had a briefing, has not even met with the government when they want his support on this urgent legislation says these blokes are absolutely dropping the ball. All right, let's go to the energy issues. A hot summer is predicted, and now there is a lot of concern. Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, this is an independent industry think tank, has warned that the Albanese government's heavy-handed intervention in our energy market risks muscling out private investment. This is, of course, as businesses struggle to keep the lights on and bills soar. Joining me now to discuss this, the Australian's Environment Editor, Graham Lloyd. Graham, the report says 4 out of 10 investors say we're not likely to touch this sector. We're concerned about Chris Bowen's sweeping interventions into energy. It's got a $320 billion infrastructure investment gap. It desperately needs private sector money, but they don't want to touch it with a barge pole. I mean, what does this mean, Graham, for our power grid?
Well, good evening, Peter. It means that there is a level of dysfunction and chaos in this transition that's really coming to the fore. Ironically, the government said it wanted to give industry security for investment by legislating a target. And this report shows that there's anything but. 4 out of 10 just want to sit on the sidelines, even though there is a desire to invest in renewable energy. The risk in doing so is too great because the government is intervening in places, changing the rules, and they're just not confident to get involved.
Today we get that report too from the energy market operator that says the system, we've had a good look at it. We're concerned about the extreme weather coming up over summer, the heat, etc., etc. They're saying we think that the system can hold up, but, and it's a big but, provided that there's no, I think they call it unexpected issues, there's no issues with deteriorating infrastructure, there's no untoward events. I mean, that basically says you get a bushfire, you get a cyclone, something else goes wrong, and we're in real trouble.
That's right. Look, we don't get any wind for a period of time, for instance, and then suddenly all the calculations change. I think it's extraordinary that the market operator is sort of saying, oh, look, we think everything's going to be okay. But then you read the fine print of the report, it says there's a shortfall of supply in Victoria and South Australia, and there's probably going to be issues in every jurisdiction. So they're really putting on a brave face, but it's obvious thing is being held together by sticky tape in effect.
Yeah, and they say in the report things like demand management. Now, what that means for people at home is we're getting all our big industry players, all our big companies, all the big smelters, we're forcing them to shut down, workers not work, companies not do their jobs over very hot periods of time, that's as predicted over summer, just so we can keep the lights on. That's the problem. Our grid can't work at its usual operational tempo, can it?
That's right. It's an extraordinary thing that we're going to sort of fortify the grid by telling people not to use electricity. We had Boral a couple of weeks ago, the big building products group, saying it's cheaper for them to just switch off and pay their staff to stand around than it is to continue working. This illustrates the weakness really that's in the system, and it needs to be bolstered to a very high degree.
Graham Lloyd, thank you. You want to wonder why we've got problems with productivity? There it is in a nutshell. All right, after the break, Australians have had enough of the PM's mass migration agenda. We'll get you some detail there. More's out on that. Plus, the Tory star, Suella Braverman, sacked by the Prime Minister, has penned a scathing letter accusing Rishi Sunak of betrayal. I'll get you that update as well. Hey, look, just for clarity, my wonderful team in my ear said the Parliament is not back next week. They are back for 2 weeks after that, so I was out by a week. But yes, there is another House week and there'll be 2 weeks of the Senate. So they can get this legislation through if they have will. Coming up too, don't forget Kel Richards, the word of the year. Your votes are in. We'll go through that as well, but let's go to a story out of New South Wales. Australian National Imams Council President, Imam Shadi Al-Sulaiman, a man who says homosexuality and extramarital sex are responsible for spreading diseases, well, he's been appointed to a Faith Affairs Council position set to advise New South Wales government on policy impacting religious groups, as well as, wait for it, harmony and security. According to The Australian, the Imam's inclusion in the council comes after he and the organisation failed to condemn racial hate sermons filled with anti-Semitism. Joining me now at my panel, John Roscombe from the Institute of Public Affairs and Nick Cater from the Menzies Research Centre. Well, I tell you what, Nick, if a Christian had sprouted such hate, there'd be no chance at all they'd be appointed to a government body. So why the double standard with this shake?
Well, you're exactly right about double standards, Peter, you remember the case of Andrew Thorburn, the former NAB executive who took up the job as CEO at Essendon last year. He lasted one day. Why? Because it was found he was associated with a church where somebody had allegedly given an anti-homosexual sermon. He hadn't even said it himself. So you've now got this guy whose words are there on the record, really quite a hateful way of talking about homosexuals, and yet is okay to join this committee. I think, though, Peter, the good thing is if it does bring home to some of these people who are sort of thoughtlessly supporting the Palestinians that the Islam does not take a kind view towards gays and LGBT people
and
in
women.
General. Perhaps it'll mean that, these groups like Gays for Palestine will pull away. They'll realise that they're backing the wrong side in backing the Palestinians.
You're not wrong, I might say, too. In the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, there is women. You won't find that in some of the Arab nations. There's, 9 Muslims, last count I looked, Muslim Arabs in the Israeli parliament and more. That's what democracy looks like. John, these students in Melbourne striking next week in support of Palestine, I have to say most of them couldn't even find Israel on a map, but there they are. They'll all be out there. This looks to me like yet another recruitment drive from the Greens, and I suspect the only thing they're going to learn at these protests is how to be anti-Semitic.
That's right, Peter. These are children being used as pawns by adults. Full credit to the Federal Labor Education Minister Jason Clare, who today said in Parliament it should be uncontroversial that children should be in school. He was supported by Sarah Henderson, the Liberal Shadow Education Minister. But here in Victoria, and Peter Dutton mentioned this in your program earlier today, Jacinta Allen has refused to condemn the protests. She said there's nothing that can be done. She said this is about democracy. Well, it's not about democracy when you recruit young people to sprout vile anti-Semitic slurs, and sadly, that is most likely what's going to happen at these protests, and the Victorian government has been nowhere to be seen on this.
I tell you, Nick Cater, this is the model that the left has used so comprehensively on climate change. They indoctrinate, they mobilise, they recruit, and then it follows through until these kids are eventually voters. They've done it on this issue and they're going to keep doing it. And of course, we saw it with the Aboriginal issue for many years. It didn't work for them on the issue of the referendum recently. I mean, that was overwhelmingly rejected, but they're not helped by the media. And you've picked up how the BBC sold Australia overseas, haven't you?
Yeah, the BBC ran a programme recently supposedly explaining what had happened in the Voice referendum, but instead of talking to perhaps some of the 9.4 million people who voted no, they brought on 4 experts who were all sort of not at all sympathetic with the no case. This is what happens, and as a result of that, you get an entirely distorted picture of the real arguments, of the truth. And I think this is what young people unfortunately suffer because you don't get you cannot understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in all its complexity and nuance simply by watching something on TikTok. And yet that's how most of these people get their news. So I think it's much better they should be in school, perhaps learning their history, learning more about the Holocaust, that defining event of the 20th century, before they start jumping to conclusions and backing the wrong side.
John, I know you're not long back from London. The UK, or former UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman, was sacked by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. She's now issued a 3-page statement. It's quite extraordinary. I urge people at home to read it. She says that Sunak has manifestly failed to deliver on his promises to reduce migration, to stop the boats and stamp out radical gender ideology in schools. I think she's spot on. I think Sunak is weak. I thought she gave a terrific speech in the US recently where she just said, the issues of integration are a huge problem for the UK. But what did you make of the extraordinary events in the last 48 hours?
Well, Peter, Suella Braverman was sacked not for being wrong, but for being right and by talking about the things the British establishment want to sweep under the carpet. So when she accused the police of double standards against anti-lockdown protesters, against women who were protesting against what police officers had done to women, versus the Palestinian protests in London, no one said she was wrong. They just said she shouldn't have spoken it out loud. Rishi Sunak is Great Britain's answer to Malcolm Turnbull. He is taking the Tories to the left. He is refusing to address the issues of mainstream concern to Tory voters, to voters throughout the UK. He wasn't selected by the party membership. He's won no popular vote. And every prediction is that when the election in the UK comes in less than a year, the Tories are going to get wiped out, and the future will be people like Suella Braverman speaking the truth.
And I might add too, the bloke he's brought back in charge of the foreign affairs portfolio, which we'll touch on, Brexit, is the guy who wanted to remain. Gents, thank you for your time. Nick Cater there and John Roscombe. After the break, Kel's words, the word of the year. Your viewer votes are in, and a whole lot of others. See you soon. Welcome back. As always, on a Wednesday, we're joined now by Kel Richards, wordsmith and broadcaster. But of course, it's a special edition tonight because we're going to get into the word of the year. Last week, you said to our viewers, send us in the suggestions. Well, the results are in. What can you tell us?
I can tell you that the votes are all in. They've all been counted. The judges have made their decision. And the Peter Credlin Sky News Australian Word of the Year for 2023 is no. N-O. So that, and it came romping in, won by a country mile. In racing parlance, it was no first, daylight second. So, and it makes perfect sense. I love it. The word that came second really surprised me. It's a word I hadn't heard until a viewer, a Credlin viewer, nominated it, controligarch. Controligarchs are celebrities or corporations that try to tell everyone else what to do. The word was only coined in 2023, but when one of your viewers put it onto the list to be voted for, the votes came flooding in, so it came second. Australians don't like being told what to do. Other words on the short list were things like voice, misinformation, diversity, colonisation, and midwit. A midwit is someone who is one step above a nitwit. And sadly, some viewers, I have to say, said they thought that covered a lot of politicians. They're a bit unkind, but there you are.
Yeah, no, I don't think they are. I've met a few midwits in my time. Another word that's been thrown up for us to discuss this week is multiculturalism. Multicultural, it's a loaded term, and it's certainly been forefront of recent debate.
It has. Coined in 1935, originally it didn't apply to countries, it applied to individuals, someone who grew up in a number of different cultures. Later it was applied to really unusual situations like Quebec, which is a francophone province in an anglophone country. But later still, it was applied to entire countries. Late 60s this started to be. And in 1973, the Whitlam government imposed it on Australia. It was never an election policy. We never got a vote on this. We simply had multiculturalism imposed on us. And the way it was imposed here by the colourful Al Grasby was that local immigrants from different cultures were encouraged to be together and maintain their home culture rather than fully integrate. The long-term result of that, way down the track, is ancient disputes, ancient warfare, ancient hatreds have been imported into Australia. And I think that's very sad.
And I think you're right to point that out, because we see in parts of Britain, certainly parts of France, and worryingly in some of our larger capital cities where there's virtually an absence of English as our language and Australian culture in some of the communities. Islamophobia, this is another one I want to pick up on, because when you're pushing politicians at the moment to call out demonstrable anti-Semitism, they've got to feel like they've got to wheel out Islamophobia at the same time.
Well, why these two are being bracketed together, we don't know. You said last night on the program that there's no evidence of Islamophobia on our streets. No one is shouting "gas the Muslims." Doesn't exist.
No.
So if politicians think they're the same, then they're not facing reality. It's always been a slightly bullying word. It started off in academia, and academics started to complain. I've seen it in academic journals that unless they entirely endorsed the Quran, they were likely to be accused of Islamophobia. It's always been that kind of bullying word. It's never referred to the kind of things that anti-Semitism does, and they should not be bracketed together.
Too true. Kel, you need to be a speechwriter in Canberra as well as a regular on this show. Thank you for your time. See you next week. That's it for me. Back tomorrow night at 6. As always, Andrew Bolt up next.